This presentation is going to be about the Civil War. And I'll start the presentation by telling you that since I was in high school, early high school years in 1961 to 64, I was always fascinated by the Civil War. My brother and I always kept up on everything, bought every book we could find. I still have many of them. My great-grandfather was from Kentucky, and his family, my mother's great-great-grandfather's family, split north and south. The North, just to make it clear about the terms, the North I refer to as the Union, the Yankees, the Northerners, or the Federals. And the South are referred to as the Confederates, the Rebels, Southerners, or Secessionists. The Civil War, the American Civil War, was the first modern era war. And by that I mean it was modern because the industrial input, the weapons, supplies, the kind of bullets that were used, they were not like bullets used even 20 years before. Artillery improved incredibly. Ships, the kinds of ships, even ironclad ships, and they covered the sides of ships with iron plates. A Gatling gun, for one of the first prototypes of a machine gun. Revolvers. You probably know what a six-cylinder revolver is. And the use of rifles, not muskets. It was a total war because it involved all of the Southerners, many of the Northerners, not all, industry, culture, society, government. It involved everybody and everything. And very important is that the size of the federal government to conduct the war, the federal government, meaning the northern government, to conduct the war, explodes in its size and responsibilities. The bottom list of states are the border states with northern states. One of the first problems was with Maryland at the beginning of the war because Maryland is north of Washington, D.C., and when Union troops were trying to come through Baltimore, Maryland, going south to Washington, there were many Southern sympathizers, pro-slavery, that were causing terrorists, that's what they were, terrorists. Missouri is filled with Southern sympathizers, but the state stayed with the Union. What is today West Virginia was created in 1863 and split from Virginia and was a new northern free state. If you look at the line between southern Ohio, Indiana, and Illinois, separating them from Kentucky, you can see what is the Ohio River, which runs into the Mississippi where western Kentucky meets eastern Missouri. Then you follow south between Tennessee and Mississippi, in Arkansas and Louisiana, that's the Mississippi River. So you can see how by 1863, at General Grant's victory at Vicksburg, the South was cut in half. The Northern Navy went up the Mississippi and controlled so that the states of Missouri, Arkansas, Louisiana, and Texas were in effect separated from the states of eastern southern states, let's say. Lincoln's inaugurated on March 4th, 1861. South Carolina's already pulled out. All the states have pulled out, the southern states. They have seceded from the Union. And by April 9th, the Confederate States of America has been created with Jefferson Davis as president. On April 14th, Fort Sumter in Charleston, South Carolina harbor is fired upon, and the war begins. The leaders of the war were Abraham Lincoln, of which much should be known. I strongly recommend, but it's up to you. Maybe you must have groups of friends within 38 students in the class that you get together and watch the movie Lincoln. It gives you a very good feeling about the war itself, and in particular about his strength, his political strength. Probably the greatest political president that the end of the United States ever had. Maybe with a list with Theodore Roosevelt, who gets things done, and Franklin Roosevelt, who got a lot of things done. But Abraham Lincoln, considering the circumstances, was the greatest president. Both Abraham Lincoln and Jefferson Davis deprecated war. They didn't want war. But one would rather make war rather than let the nation survive, and the other would accept war rather than let it perish. And the war came. Who were these people? The Southerners, they saw that the Yankees were the aggressors. The Yankees were people, they hated Northerners. They called them city slickers, dandified, money-hungry capitalists, industrialists, cold-blooded. The Southerners saw themselves, the upper class at least, as very civilized and chivalrous. So if you look up the word, if you don't know what it means, look up the word chivalry. Great gentleman. You have to watch it's too long, but there's a movie called Gone with the Wind, certainly sympathetic to the Southern cause. It was made back in the early 1940s with Clark Gable and Vivian Leigh, and you will see they're all chivalrous gentlemen. The Northerners, they called the Southerners a bunch of farmers, country boys, hicks, hayseeds, uncivilized, people who are lost when they get to the cities, a backward agricultural industry, a country, states. And the Northerners, they thought of themselves as sophisticated businessmen, entrepreneurs, industrialists, and superior people to the Southerners. When you look at this chart, you note the advantages in population. If a Southerner had seen this chart at the beginning of the war, maybe they would have been smart enough not to have a war. The war was lost before it was ever started. The North had more people, better railroads, and you have to think about the importance of railroads, because back in those days, they didn't have paved roads. They had dirt roads. If they had roads at all, they were trails through the woods. Industrial workers, it was a richer, much richer than northern states. The North was already in the industrial age. The South was not. The South was 50 years or more behind the North in industry. It had one or two factories that, if anything, and the North had hundreds. Absolute advantage. You might study this in a business class, that some countries have absolute advantage over others because they're better at producing something over others. The North, like I said, 22 million people, 90% of all the industry in the United States, including munitions, arms, armaments, the Navy, the railroads. The South didn't have a chance. The South had one thing, cotton. They produced cotton, and they had to defend the system because it was the slaves that could be bought and sold that picked the cotton. The South, pluses and minuses, had the best generals. The system was that the Southern generals had been officers in the Union Army before the separation of the North and South. There was only one army. They had all gone to, in the United States, high-level military officers are almost always graduated Army officers from West Point, which is a military academy just north of New York City. The naval officers go to Annapolis, which is just east of Washington, D.C. area, Annapolis, Maryland. The Southerners, they thought that they were better fighters than factory workers because the Southerners were from farmland and carried a gun and were tougher outdoors guys. But they had a small population. No industry, no musicians. They couldn't support a war. And it showed very quickly, too. What the Southerners fought for? Slavery. And their distinct way of life. They were they needed the slaves, control of the slaves, because that's what set up the hierarchical system of culture. Black slaves being the lowest on the then above, and blacks themselves being divided by the color of their skin, the darker being the lowest, the not so dark being less low, the lighter skin mixed race being higher, and then the lowest of whites. So even the lowest of whites, the poorest of white person, was still higher than blacks. The Southerners also feared freedom of the slaves, because if they did that, then slaves would revolt and start killing people, whites. And the Southerners feared that if more and more states became free states, then they would suffer the tyranny of the central federal government in Washington, and eventually there would be laws passed against slavery, and that would destroy their peculiar institution. The Northerners thought to defend the American democratic system of government. Secession threatened the Union. The Northerners, some fought to do away with slavery, and eventually by the beginning of 1863, that was the cry, was to free the slaves. In April 1861, the Confederate fire on Fort Sumter in Charleston, South Carolina Harbor. I visited the place. It's pretty magnificent to stand out there and think this is where it all started. Lincoln calls volunteers to put down the rebellion. The first big battle, clash between the Southern armies and the Northern Army, was at a place, a little river, in English, a very small creek. It might be called a creek, or it might be called a run, but a small creek. It was a disaster for the North. They weren't prepared. They were very badly led. The Southerners, better led, in this case by a general named Stonewall Jackson, stood up to the Union, and the Union troops broke and ran back to Washington. I skipped other battles, and I'm going to just talk about two of the most important battles. On September 17th, 1862, General Lee, the commander of the Northern Army of Northern Virginia, makes his first venture across the Potomac River, the Potomac in Maryland, separating Maryland from Virginia. He crosses at a little small village actually called Sharpsburg. My sister lives about 4 miles from this place, Antietam. It's the bloodiest single day of the whole war, much bloodier than everything else that comes after it, for one day of killing. The battle was a draw. The Union should have won, but they didn't. The Confederate soldiers, right at the end of the battle, on one side of the battle, brought up reinforcements and stopped the Union soldiers from overrunning. And then the next morning, after one day of killing, they started burying the dead. You can see the videos I've suggested. But I put down that it was the first turning point of the war, because all through 1861 and up until Antietam in 1862, the South had been winning the war. Lincoln couldn't find winning generals. You can see some of the battlefield here. The upper right-hand corner is General Burnside's bridge. I still have a piece, actually I have a piece of stone from the bridge over here beside me in my office at home. Thousands of men died on that bridge, getting across that bridge. On the left is something called Bloody Lane. Actually, it's an indentation. It was an old farm road. And all the soldiers laying there are Confederate soldiers mowed down by the Union soldiers. And then on the lower right, the building is called the Dunker Church. And laying in front of it are the dead of a Confederate artillery soldiers. My son and I have walked this battlefield, one end to the other, sat in Bloody Lane for many hours, just thinking about what happened on that spot. On the left are more Confederate dead, and on the right is, if you look right in the middle, is Abraham Lincoln, which you will note quickly is at least 6'4" tall. And number 1, 2, 3, 4, 5, the sixth soldier from the left facing Lincoln is General McClellan. Take the time, if you want. You don't have to. There's no grade for this. I'm put these things up for to help you learn more about it, about what's happening. The Battle of Antietam on YouTube, and a very good documentary by James Earl Jones about Antietam. The real turning point about Antietam is the Emancipation Proclamation. The victory at Antietam gave Lincoln the political power to issue the Emancipation Proclamation, and the North now had a cause to fight for. The Emancipation Proclamation said that all persons held as slaves within the rebellious areas are and henceforth shall be free. Not the ones in those few states that I mentioned that were not in rebellion, like in Kentucky and Maryland, in Missouri and Delaware, still maybe have slaves. They weren't free. But it was a great political move on Lincoln's part. Other battles that are, if you look at YouTube, you can find virtual tours of the battlefields, so you can see what I do in my spare time. Fredericksburg was a Confederate victory. General Lee destroyed the Union Army out in front at Fredericksburg. And Chancellorsville was another Union victory. General Lee destroyed the army again because the Union did not have good leadership. And finally, I put here, we skipped from 1862 to 1863, the fall of Vicksburg, which I mentioned earlier, is the splitting of the Confederacy. General Grant finally conquers Vicksburg, and the Union Army controls the Mississippi. Even when you're a very, very young student in schools in the United States, maybe even in grade school, it's been a long time, I don't remember, you learn about Gettysburg. In the summer of 1863, July 1st, 2nd, and 3rd, and there's some great videos last month on the 150th reenactment of the Battle of Gettysburg. Lee invades the North again for the second and last time. And he meets General George Meade's army in a small Pennsylvania town. Actually, the only reason the Southern soldiers went there was there was a shoe factory, and they were trying to find some shoes. And all of a sudden, there's a large Union army coming up to face them. It's a 3-day battle, back and forth. Some of the most tremendous fighting in the whole war after Antietam. There were some other pretty horrible things, but this battle was the end of the Confederacy. I put this Pickett's Charge. You can see it on my YouTube page, the Broward College Ecuador history site. It's the last. I think it's like 25 minutes of the Southern soldiers lining up, 13,000 men lining up, shoulder to shoulder, marching across 1 mile into the Union soldiers' lines, and they lost. They couldn't break the Union. In those days, the point was to line up. The armies march against each other, or one army marches against, in this case, the Union soldiers are behind a stone wall to try to drive the enemy from the battlefield. The Confederates actually made it up to that wall and even got over it, some of them, but they couldn't sustain it. And they had to withdraw Lee withdraws his army to the south, and they should have known it was over, but they didn't. Watch the movie Pickett's Charge to get an idea what it must have been, but maybe you want to look on Wikipedia to read a little bit about the charge so you understand what's happening. In November of 1863, Lincoln goes to the cemetery at Gettysburg, and he makes the greatest speech in American history. Just yesterday they were celebrating the 50th anniversary of Martin Luther King's speech during the March I Have a Dream speech. Well, that's still second to Gettysburg Address, and you'll forgive me if I read it because I find it amazing, and it's very common for little kids in school, and I had to do it too, to memorize this, to give at Memorial Day ceremonies. And Lincoln said, 77 years ago, our fathers brought forth on this continent a new nation, a nation conceived in liberty and dedicated to the proposition that all men are created equal. Now we are engaged in a great civil war, testing whether that nation or any nation so conceived and so dedicated can so long endure. We are met on a great battlefield of that war. We have come to dedicate a portion of that field as their final resting place for those who here gave their lives that that nation might live. It is altogether fitting and proper we should do this. But in a larger sense, we cannot dedicate, we cannot concentrate, we cannot hallow this ground. The brave men, living and dead, who struggled here have consecrated it, far above our poor power to add or detract. The world will little note nor long remember what we say here, but it can never forget what they did here. It is for us, the living, rather to be dedicated here to the unfinished work which they who fought here have thus far so nobly advanced. It is rather for us to be here dedicated to the great task remaining for us, that from these honored dead we take increased devotion to that cause, which for they gave the last full measure of devotion, that we here highly resolve these dead shall not have died in vain, that this nation, under God, shall have a new birth of freedom, and that government of the people, by the people, for the people, shall not perish from the earth. In 1864, the Union's winning. General Grant beats the Confederates in what's called the Wilderness north of Richmond, and then he defeats in the siege of Petersburg. In the South, General Sherman captures Atlanta, Georgia, and then he marches from Atlanta to Savannah, destroying everything in his way. Sherman's march to the sea is still remembered by Georgians with great disgust. In 1865 is the end. The Confederacy is collapsing. The soldiers don't have shoes, don't have food, don't have weapons, don't have bullets. Sherman marches north through South Carolina first, Charleston, Columbia, South Carolina, then on to North Carolina. Richmond falls to the Union. On April 9th, 1865, General Lee and General Grant meet at Appomattox Courthouse. The Confederacy surrenders. And then on April 14th, Lincoln's assassinated. And one will always have to wonder, would Reconstruction have been different if Lincoln had not been assassinated? I think it would have been very different. Thank you.